The people who judge you first are often the least prepared for the truth. That thought had followed Ethan Carter through most of his adult life, but on a bright Saturday morning in downtown Chicago, he had no idea those words were about to become real in front of hundreds of strangers. Ethan adjusted the mirror inside the black luxury SUV before turning off the engine beneath the sweeping entrance of the Grand Windsor Hotel. The marble driveway sparkled beneath the summer sun, while photographers crowded behind velvet ropes, waiting for the city's wealthiest executives to arrive for the Bennett Global Foundation Gala, an event that local news stations called the most influential business gathering of the year. Ethan stepped out, smoothed the wrinkles from his simple Navy driver uniform, and opened the rear door for his passenger with the same quiet professionalism he had practiced for nearly 15 years. His customer thanked him politely before disappearing toward the grand staircase, where reporters immediately surrounded him with flashing cameras. Ethan remained beside the vehicle, checking his schedule on an aging phone whose cracked screen barely responded to his fingertips. He had 3 more pickups before noon, another airport run in the afternoon, and enough overtime to help pay next month's rent. It was an ordinary day. At least that was what he believed. A young valet wearing an expensive tailored jacket glanced at Ethan's SUV and smirked. "You might want to park around the back. This entrance is reserved for guests." Ethan smiled gently. "I understand. I am only waiting for instructions from dispatch." The valet shrugged as though speaking to someone invisible before walking away without another word. It was not the first time Ethan had been treated like part of the scenery. People noticed the luxury vehicle but rarely the man standing beside it. A group of elegantly dressed guests walked past him carrying designer handbags and polished leather briefcases worth more than Ethan probably earned in several months. One woman lowered her sunglasses just enough to whisper to her companion, not nearly quietly enough, "Drivers are getting younger every year." Her friend laughed softly. Ethan simply looked away. Years ago those comments might have stung. Now they passed through him like a cool breeze. Life had taught him that dignity did not depend on another person's opinion. As another limousine rolled onto the circular driveway, security guards became increasingly busy directing traffic. One of them approached Ethan with an impatient wave. "Move the SUV. We need space for VIP arrivals." Ethan nodded immediately and climbed behind the wheel, but before he could start the engine, his dispatcher called. "Stay where you are, Ethan. One of the event organizers may need transportation in a few minutes." "Understood," Ethan replied. He switched off the ignition once again. The security guard frowned. "Did you not hear me?" Ethan calmly explained the instructions. The guard sighed dramatically before muttering, "Typical." Nearby, a few guests watched the exchange with amused expressions, as though a driver being scolded was part of the entertainment. Ethan ignored them and quietly folded his hands over the steering wheel while waiting. His eyes wandered toward the enormous hotel entrance where crystal chandeliers shimmered beyond towering glass doors. Families posed for photographs, business leaders exchanged confident handshakes, and television crews prepared live broadcasts. Ethan wondered what it felt like to belong inside a place like that. He quickly dismissed the thought. Some dreams had stopped visiting him long ago. Deep inside his wallet rested an old photograph with faded edges. He had carried it everywhere for more than 20 years. He almost reached for it out of habit but stopped himself. Certain memories still hurt even after decades had passed. Instead, he took a slow breath and looked toward the entrance once more. At that exact moment, a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop beneath the hotel canopy. Every conversation around the driveway seemed to pause. Security officers straightened their posture. Reporters rushed forward. Cameras lifted into the air. The billionaire everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived, and before anyone realized it, his eyes settled not on the executives lining up to greet him, but on the quiet driver standing alone beside a black SUV. Lucas Bennett stepped out of the sedan without appearing to notice the chorus of greetings waiting for him. Members of the board smiled confidently, reporters called his name, and photographers fired one flash after another, expecting the billionaire to pause for the traditional photographs that would appear on every business website before sunset. Instead, Lucas stood perfectly still beneath the hotel entrance. His attention never drifted toward the cameras. It remained fixed on the quiet driver standing several yards away beside the black SUV. Ethan noticed the unfamiliar stare almost immediately. At first he assumed the billionaire was simply looking past him, so he politely stepped aside to clear the walkway. Yet the man's eyes followed him with the same quiet intensity. It was not hostility. It was not curiosity alone. It looked more like someone trying to remember a dream that had almost disappeared. Lucas slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing calm blue eyes that suddenly seemed much older than his 34 years. Around him, assistants continued discussing schedules, interviews, and speeches, but their voices faded into the background. His chief assistant finally whispered, "Mr. Bennett, everyone is waiting for your opening remarks." Lucas answered without taking his eyes off Ethan. "Give me a minute." The assistant looked confused. That had never happened before. Lucas Bennett was known for precision. Every minute of every day was planned months in advance. Delays were simply not part of his personality. Ethan lowered his head politely before returning to wipe a small fingerprint from the SUV's chrome door handle. He preferred avoiding attention whenever possible. A lifetime of disappointment had taught him that expectations usually led to heartbreak. As he worked, he became aware that the billionaire was slowly walking in his direction. Security personnel instinctively followed several steps behind, creating a respectful distance between Lucas and everyone else. Guests immediately assumed the billionaire intended to inspect the transportation arrangements. One executive even joked quietly, "That poor driver is probably about to lose his job." A few nearby guests smiled at the remark. Ethan remained calm as Lucas finally stopped only a few feet away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Lucas studied Ethan's face with extraordinary concentration, noticing the faint lines around his eyes, the silver beginning to appear in his dark hair, and a tiny scar just above his left eyebrow. Something inside him tightened. It was the same scar he had seen countless times in an old photograph hidden inside a small wooden box that had belonged to his late grandmother. As a child, he had often asked who the smiling young man in the picture was. Every adult had given him a different answer. Eventually, they had stopped answering altogether. Ethan offered the professional smile he gave every customer. "Good morning, sir. Do you need transportation today?" Lucas hesitated before quietly asking, "How long have you been driving?" Ethan considered the unexpected question. "Almost 15 years. Before that, construction, warehouse work, anything that paid the bills." Lucas nodded slowly, as though every word carried unexpected meaning. "Have you always lived in Chicago?" Ethan smiled faintly. "No. I moved here a long time ago hoping for a fresh start." Those words landed heavily inside Lucas. A fresh start. His grandmother had once written exactly those words in the margin of an old journal that Lucas had secretly read after her passing. He had never forgotten them. The assistant stepped forward again. "Mr. Bennett, the board is waiting." Lucas raised one hand without looking away from Ethan. "Tell them 5 more minutes." Murmurs immediately spread across the entrance. Reporters began whispering that something unusual was happening. Camera operators quietly adjusted their lenses toward the unexpected conversation. Ethan grew increasingly uncomfortable with so many people watching. "Sir, I do not want to keep you from your event." Lucas smiled politely for the first time that morning. "You are not keeping me from anything." Ethan gave a puzzled look before his dispatcher called again. "Ethan, change of plans. Stay available. One of the VIP guests may request a private driver after lunch." "Understood," Ethan replied before slipping the phone back into his pocket. As he did, his worn leather wallet briefly fell onto the pavement. Ethan quickly bent down to pick it up, but not before a faded photograph partially slid from one side. Lucas instinctively glanced downward. The image showed a young man standing beside a small lake with a smiling woman whose face had been carefully folded away over the years. Yet one detail immediately captured Lucas's attention. Around the young man's neck hung an old silver compass pendant shaped like an 8-pointed star. Lucas felt the air leave his lungs. His own childhood memory flashed before him with startling clarity. When he was 5 years old, before bedtime every night, he used to hold an identical silver pendant while his grandmother whispered, "One day it will lead you home." He had not seen another one like it in nearly 3 decades, and suddenly the impossible no longer felt impossible. Lucas stood motionless as memories he had buried for years began connecting themselves in ways logic could not explain. The silver compass pendant was identical down to the smallest engraved line. His grandmother had once told him it belonged to someone who always knew how to find his way home, even when the road disappeared. Every time Lucas asked whose pendant it had been, she would smile sadly and change the subject. After she passed away, he searched through every family record he could legally access, but entire chapters of his childhood had been erased as though someone had carefully rewritten history. Ethan noticed the billionaire staring at the old photograph and quickly slipped it back into his wallet. "It is nothing special," he said with an embarrassed smile. "Just an old picture that has traveled with me for a long time." Lucas looked into Ethan's eyes. "Where did you get that pendant?" Ethan instinctively touched the silver compass hanging beneath his shirt. "My father gave it to me when I graduated from high school. He told me that no matter how lost I became, I should never forget who I was." Lucas felt his heartbeat quicken. The words sounded painfully familiar. His grandmother had once repeated almost the same sentence while placing her hand on his shoulder before his first day of elementary school. For years he believed she had invented it herself. Now he was no longer certain. Before Lucas could ask another question, an elderly woman approached with graceful confidence. Olivia Bennett, elegant as always despite the passing years, had just arrived through a private entrance reserved for the Bennett family. She immediately noticed Lucas standing beside a driver instead of greeting distinguished guests. "Lucas," she called warmly, "everyone is waiting for you." Lucas turned briefly toward his mother but did not move. Olivia followed his gaze until her eyes settled on Ethan. The color slowly drained from her face. For one brief second she completely forgot how to breathe. Ethan looked at her politely without any sign of recognition. More than 20 years had transformed them both. Time had added silver to his hair and quiet strength to his expression, while Olivia's youthful smile had been replaced by the composed elegance expected from the chairwoman of one of the country's largest charitable foundations. Yet somewhere deep inside, a forgotten memory stirred. Ethan felt an odd sense of familiarity he could not explain. Olivia recovered almost instantly, forcing a pleasant smile that looked natural to everyone except Lucas. "Good morning," she said politely before gently taking her son's arm. "We really should go inside." Lucas remained still. "Do you know him?" The question landed between them with unexpected weight. Olivia looked directly at Ethan for another second before calmly answering, "No." "Should I?" Lucas studied her expression carefully. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions by reading faces across conference tables. Tiny changes around the eyes often revealed far more than words ever could. His mother almost never hesitated before speaking. This time she had. It lasted less than a second, but he noticed. Ethan sensed he was standing in the middle of something that did not concern him. "Excuse me," he said respectfully. "I should move the vehicle before I cause any more trouble." Lucas unexpectedly replied, "Please stay." Ethan looked surprised. Olivia looked even more surprised. Nearby reporters quietly continued filming what they assumed was an unusual interaction between the famous billionaire and an employee. None of them realized the real story had not even begun. Lucas finally forced himself to walk toward the hotel entrance beside his mother. As they climbed the marble steps, he asked quietly enough that only she could hear, "Did Grandma ever tell you about a silver compass pendant?" Olivia's pace slowed almost imperceptibly. "Why would you ask that?" "Because the driver has one," she answered without looking at him. "Many people own old jewelry," Lucas continued. "Not one exactly like ours." Olivia stopped walking for the first time. "Lucas, today is an important day for the company. Do not distract yourself with coincidences." She resumed walking before he could respond. Inside the grand ballroom, guests applauded as Lucas entered, but he barely heard them. His attention drifted toward the glass entrance where Ethan was carefully guiding the black SUV toward the designated parking area. Something inside Lucas refused to let the moment go. Coincidences happen once. Twice was unusual. But the scar, the pendant, the photograph, the familiar words, and now his mother's unmistakable reaction formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. As speeches began and investors discussed expansion plans worth billions of dollars, Lucas quietly opened the secure notes application on his phone and typed a single instruction to his private chief of security. The message contained only one sentence. Find everything you can about Ethan Carter. Do not inform anyone, including my family. The applause inside the grand ballroom echoed through polished marble walls, but Lucas Bennett barely heard a single word of the keynote presentation. Executives discussed market forecasts, charitable initiatives, and international expansion while graphs appeared across enormous screens. Yet his attention remained fixed on one unanswered question. Who was Ethan Carter? Every instinct that had helped him build one of the country's fastest-growing investment firms now told him that the answer mattered far more than any business deal taking place that morning. Without drawing attention, Lucas excused himself during a brief intermission and entered a quiet conference room overlooking the Chicago River. Within minutes, his chief of security, Daniel Brooks, arrived carrying a tablet. Daniel had spent 12 years handling the Bennett family's most confidential matters. If anyone could uncover the truth discreetly, it was him. Lucas closed the door. I need everything you can find on a man named Ethan Carter. He is driving for Premier Executive Transportation today. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Is this related to a security concern? Lucas paused before answering. I do not know yet, but I want complete accuracy. No assumptions. Daniel nodded. I will start immediately. Less than an hour later, while guests enjoyed lunch beneath crystal chandeliers, Daniel returned with the first report. Ethan Carter, 56 years old. Lives alone in a modest apartment on the northwest side of the city. No criminal history. Excellent employment record. Never missed a tax filing. No outstanding lawsuits. No unusual financial activity. Lucas quietly listened. Keep going. Daniel scrolled through additional records. His employment history is consistent. Construction, warehouse logistics, delivery services, then executive transportation. Former supervisors describe him as dependable, honest, and unusually calm under pressure. Lucas expected something that explained the strange connection he felt. Instead, the report only made Ethan appear more ordinary. Family? Daniel hesitated for the first time. That is where things become unusual. Lucas leaned forward. Explain. There are almost no records before 26 years ago. Medical files exist. Employment records exist. Tax documents exist. But family information from earlier years is remarkably limited. Lucas frowned. Limited because it is old? Daniel slowly shook his head. Limited because portions appear to have disappeared. Silence filled the room. Daniel enlarged several archived documents. There are references to sealed court filings, amended birth registrations, and restricted hospital records connected to the early 1990s. Normally that requires a legal order or extraordinary circumstances. Lucas stared at the screen. Who requested those restrictions? Daniel answered carefully. The names are no longer visible. Lucas had spent years negotiating with powerful families. Records did not simply erase themselves. Someone with influence had wanted those files hidden. Can you recover them? Daniel nodded cautiously. Eventually. It will take time. Lucas looked through the conference room window toward the hotel entrance below. Ethan was helping an elderly couple load luggage into another vehicle, smiling with the same quiet kindness he had shown everyone else. There was no trace of ambition, resentment, or calculation in his expression. If he was hiding something, he was doing it remarkably well. Daniel continued, There is one more thing. He opened another document containing a faded newspaper clipping from nearly 28 years earlier. It showed a community scholarship ceremony in a small Illinois town. A much younger Ethan stood proudly beside a teenage volunteer coordinator while wearing the same silver compass pendant around his neck. Lucas immediately recognized the woman standing beside him. Although she was much younger, there was no mistaking Olivia Bennett. She was smiling naturally, without the practiced expression she wore at public events today. Lucas felt his pulse quicken. Zoom in. Daniel enlarged the photograph until their faces nearly filled the screen. Ethan looked genuinely happy. Olivia looked deeply comfortable beside him. They were standing much closer than strangers normally would. Daniel quietly observed, "Public records describe her as a university volunteer during that period. There is no mention of Mr. Carter beyond his scholarship award." Lucas whispered almost to himself, "My mother said she had never seen him before today." Daniel remained silent. He knew better than to interrupt. Lucas continued studying the image until another detail emerged. Olivia's left hand rested lightly against Ethan's arm, and on her wrist was a delicate silver bracelet Lucas had only seen in one other place. It had been preserved inside his grandmother's personal keepsake box together with several family photographs that no one ever discussed. His grandmother had once called it the happiest summer of someone's life before suddenly refusing to explain further. Lucas slowly closed the tablet and looked directly at Daniel. "I want access to every restricted hospital record, every sealed legal document, every archived photograph, and every witness you can find from that town. I do not care how long it takes." Daniel nodded. "Understood." As Daniel turned to leave, his secure phone vibrated unexpectedly. He glanced at the message, then looked back at Lucas with an expression neither surprised nor frightened, but deeply unsettled. "Sir," he said quietly, "someone has already begun monitoring our search. They know we are asking questions." The final session of the Bennett Global Foundation Gala was scheduled to begin at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was the most anticipated moment of the day, when Lucas Bennett would announce a historic charitable investment expected to dominate national headlines by evening. Every seat inside the grand ballroom was filled. Television cameras lined the back wall. Journalists prepared live updates, and distinguished guests spoke in quiet voices while waiting for the billionaire to take the stage. Outside, Ethan Carter received one last transportation request before ending his shift. An elderly donor needed assistance reaching the ballroom after arriving later than expected. Ethan opened the vehicle door, offered a steady hand, and patiently walked beside the gentleman through the hotel lobby. "Thank you," the older man said with a warm smile. "Not many people slow down anymore." Ethan answered softly, "Everyone deserves to arrive with dignity." The simple response unexpectedly reached the ears of several nearby guests, including one reporter who quietly smiled before returning to her notebook. Ethan escorted the gentleman to the ballroom entrance and prepared to leave through a side hallway reserved for hotel staff. Before he could turn away, a familiar voice called his name. "Mr. Carter." Ethan looked back. Lucas Bennett was standing. Only a few yards away, no security between them this time. His expression remained calm, yet there was unmistakable determination behind his eyes. "Would you please wait a few more minutes before leaving?" Ethan looked surprised. "Of course, sir, if you need transportation." Lucas smiled faintly. "It is not transportation that I need." Before Ethan could ask another question, an event coordinator hurried over. "Mr. Bennett, we are ready. The cameras are live." Lucas nodded once and walked toward the stage. Ethan assumed the conversation had ended, so he quietly remained near the rear entrance, hoping to avoid interrupting the ceremony. From his position, he could barely see the enormous stage framed by blue lights and giant digital screens displaying the Bennett Foundation logo. The audience erupted into applause as Lucas approached the podium. He thanked the guests, recognized several charitable partners, and briefly discussed the importance of creating opportunities for future generations. Everything appeared completely normal. Olivia Bennett watched proudly from the front row beside senior board members and family friends. Richard Bennett sat beside her with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every important decision around him. Daniel Brooks remained discreetly near the side of the stage, carefully observing the room while remembering the mysterious warning that someone had been monitoring their investigation. Lucas reached the prepared portion of his speech, then quietly closed the leather folder containing his remarks. The audience assumed he had simply memorized the remainder. Instead, he stepped away from the podium. A ripple of confusion spread across the ballroom. Even the television producers exchanged uncertain glances. Lucas slowly looked across the crowd until his eyes found Ethan standing quietly near the exit, almost hidden behind a decorative marble column. "Before we continue today's announcement," Lucas said clearly, "there is someone in this room I would like to thank." Ethan instinctively looked behind himself, believing Lucas must be referring to someone else. Several cameras automatically searched the audience for a famous guest. Lucas began walking down the center aisle instead of remaining on stage. Guests turned in their seats to follow him. Whispered conversations spread through the ballroom. Olivia's smile slowly disappeared. Richard leaned forward with growing concern. Lucas continued walking until he reached the very back of the room. He stopped directly in front of Ethan. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Hundreds of people watched in complete silence. Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think there has been some misunderstanding." Lucas did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted briefly toward the faded leather wallet still visible inside Ethan's jacket pocket. He remembered the photograph, the pendant, the hidden records, his mother's reaction, and every unanswered question that had led him to this moment. Deep inside, reason warned him to wait for absolute proof. But another voice, older and impossible to ignore, told him that some truths revealed themselves long before documents ever could. Lucas took one slow breath. Then, in a voice steady enough for every microphone in the ballroom to capture, he looked directly into Ethan's eyes and said, "I have spent my entire life searching for someone I never truly believed I would find. If my heart is right, then there is only one way I can address you." The room became perfectly still. Olivia rose halfway from her chair. Richard's face turned pale. Ethan stared at Lucas in complete confusion. Then Lucas smiled with quiet emotion and spoke a single word that echoed through the silent ballroom. "Dad." Silence settled over the ballroom with such overwhelming force that even the television cameras seemed frozen in place. Ethan Carter stood motionless, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. His eyes searched Lucas Bennett's face, hoping to find some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a publicity stunt, or perhaps a cruel mistake. Instead, he saw only sincerity mixed with quiet hope. Ethan slowly shook his head. "Sir," he said gently, "I think you have mistaken me for someone else." Lucas did not move. "I have considered that possibility since the moment I saw you this morning." Ethan forced a small, uncertain smile. "Then perhaps you should continue considering it." A few nervous laughs escaped from scattered guests who assumed the awkward moment would soon end. No one else laughed. Olivia Bennett remained standing, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Richard Bennett rose from his chair with a firm expression that reflected decades of authority. "Lucas," he called in a controlled voice, "this event is not the place for personal confusion. Return to the stage." Lucas looked toward his grandfather but did not step away from Ethan. "This became personal long before today." Richard answered sharply, "Enough." Daniel Brooks quietly signaled security to remain where they were. There was no danger in the room, only uncertainty, and he understood that interfering now would only make the situation worse. Ethan looked around at the hundreds of unfamiliar faces watching him. Every instinct told him to leave immediately. He had spent his entire life avoiding unnecessary attention, and now every camera in the ballroom pointed directly at him. "Mr. Bennett," Ethan said softly, "I appreciate your kindness, but my shift is almost over. I believe your family needs you more than I do." Lucas replied without hesitation, "What if you are my family?" The words struck Ethan harder than he expected. Something deep inside him shifted, not because he believed them, but because of the impossible longing behind them. He had once imagined hearing those words from someone long ago, before life had taken a direction he never expected. He slowly reached into his jacket and removed the worn leather wallet. Opening it carefully, He looked at the faded photograph inside before quietly speaking. Many years ago, I was told that the family I dreamed about was gone forever. After enough time, you stop asking questions because the answers only hurt more. Lucas listened without interrupting. Olivia closed her eyes for a brief moment as though every sentence carried memories she had spent decades trying to bury. Ethan continued, "There was someone I loved when I was young. We planned a future together. Then everything disappeared almost overnight. I was told she had left, that our child had not survived, and that there was nothing left to wait for." Gasps spread quietly across the audience. Olivia lowered her head, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. Lucas slowly turned toward his mother. "Is any part of what he just said true?" Olivia tried to answer, but no words came. Richard stepped forward instead. "This conversation is over." Lucas looked directly at him. "Why are you answering for her?" Richard's calm expression began to crack. "Because emotions do not change facts." Lucas replied, "Then let us discuss facts." He reached into his jacket and removed the enlarged copy of the old scholarship photograph Daniel had prepared only an hour earlier. Without speaking, he handed it to Ethan. Ethan stared at the image. His hands immediately began to tremble. He recognized the younger version of himself standing beside a smiling college volunteer. For several seconds, he could not breathe. He slowly lifted his eyes toward Olivia. "Olivia?" he whispered in disbelief. Tears formed in her eyes before she could stop them. 26 years had changed their faces, but not the memories suddenly flooding back into both of them. Ethan took one uncertain step forward. "It really is you." Olivia covered her mouth with trembling fingers. She wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, yet years of silence had left her unable to find the first sentence. Richard immediately moved beside her. "Do not say another word." Lucas looked from his grandfather to his mother, then back to Ethan. The missing pieces were beginning to align, but one question still remained unanswered. "Mother," he said quietly, "did you know this entire time?" Olivia slowly nodded once, almost too faintly for anyone to notice. The ballroom erupted into stunned whispers. Ethan looked at her with heartbreak rather than anger. "If you knew," he asked softly, "why did you never come back?" Olivia's tears finally escaped as she struggled to answer. Before she could speak, Richard interrupted once more with unexpected urgency. "Because I made sure she never could." Richard Bennett's confession shattered the last illusion of composure inside the ballroom. Reporters who had spent the morning preparing stories about philanthropy suddenly found themselves witnessing a deeply personal truth unfolding in front of live cameras. No one reached for the exit. No one looked at a phone. Every eye remained fixed on the Bennett family. Richard slowly straightened his jacket, realizing there was no longer any point pretending. "Yes," he said firmly. "I made the decision, and I would make it again." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. Lucas felt his jaw tighten, while Olivia quietly wiped tears from her face. Richard continued in the calm voice of a man who had spent a lifetime believing difficult choices could always be justified. 26 years ago, this family stood on the edge of building an international company. Olivia was young, emotional, and willing to throw away her future for a man who could barely support himself. "I refused to allow that to happen." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before asking, "So you decided my future as well?" Richard answered without hesitation. "I decided what was necessary." Olivia finally found her voice. "Necessary?" she whispered. "You told me Ethan had abandoned us." Richard did not deny it. "Because you would never have left otherwise." Ethan looked toward Olivia with heartbreaking confusion. "I received a letter saying you had chosen another life and that our baby did not survive. I believed every word because I loved you enough to accept your decision." Olivia covered her face as tears flowed freely. "I never wrote that letter." Ethan's breathing became unsteady. For more than 2 decades he had carried guilt, believing he had somehow failed the woman he loved. Olivia had spent those same years believing he had walked away without looking back. Lucas slowly looked from one parent to the other, realizing they had both been victims of the same deception. Richard remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. Once Lucas was born, I arranged for the records to be sealed. My lawyers handled everything legally. Ethan disappeared from our lives, and Olivia eventually accepted reality. Olivia turned toward her father with quiet strength that no one in the room had ever seen before. I did not accept reality. I accepted the lie you created because I trusted you. Richard's expression softened for the first time. I believed time would heal the pain. Ethan answered gently, "Time cannot heal a wound that was never allowed to tell the truth." The words echoed through the ballroom with greater force than any accusation could have carried. Even those who had admired Richard Bennett for decades now lowered their eyes. Lucas stepped beside Ethan instead of returning to his family's side. The movement alone spoke louder than any speech. Richard noticed immediately. "Lucas," he said carefully, "everything I did was to protect this family and the company that now supports thousands of employees." Lucas shook his head. "A company built on success can recover from almost anything. A family built on lies cannot." Daniel Brooks quietly approached and handed Lucas a secure folder. "The remaining archive files arrived 5 minutes ago," he said softly. Lucas opened the folder and found certified copies of hospital records, amended legal documents, and sworn statements that had been sealed for decades. Every page confirmed the same painful story. Ethan had never abandoned Olivia. Olivia had never chosen another man. Their separation had been carefully engineered through false letters, restricted records, and deliberate silence. Lucas slowly handed the documents to his mother. She read only the first page before closing the folder with trembling hands. "I wasted 26 years believing the wrong person," she whispered. Ethan looked at her with compassion instead of resentment. "We both did." That simple sentence broke whatever emotional walls still remained between them. Around the ballroom, many guests quietly wiped away tears. Even the reporters stopped taking notes for a moment, recognizing that they were witnessing something far greater than a business story. Richard looked around the room and realized that authority, wealth, and reputation could not protect him from the weight of truth. He took one slow breath before speaking to Ethan directly for the first time. "You have every reason to hate me." Ethan considered the statement before calmly replying, "Hatred would only steal more years from all of us. I have already lost enough." Lucas looked at Ethan with growing admiration. The man who had been mocked as nothing more than a driver that morning possessed a quiet dignity that no title, fortune, or board position could ever create. In that moment, Lucas understood that the greatest inheritance he had ever searched for was not hidden inside trust funds or corporate documents. It was standing beside him, choosing grace when every reason existed to choose bitterness. No one left the ballroom after the truth came to light. The scheduled business announcements no longer mattered. News producers quietly changed their headlines while reporters lowered their microphones, sensing that the most meaningful story of the day was no longer about money or corporate success. It was about a family that had finally found the courage to face the truth. Lucas stood beside Ethan without hesitation, and that single decision was noticed by every executive, every investor, and every employee in attendance. Richard Bennett remained silent for a long moment before looking toward the board members who had worked beside him for decades. He slowly removed the chairman's ceremonial pin from his suit jacket and placed it on the nearest table. "I spent my life believing that protecting a legacy required controlling every outcome," he said quietly. "Today I understand that I confused success with fear." No one interrupted him. Olivia walked toward Ethan, stopping only an arm's length away. Her eyes searched his face as though trying to recognize the young man she had loved so many years before. "I cannot ask you to forgive 26 years, she whispered, "but I need you to know that there was not a single birthday, not a single Christmas, and not a single year that passed without wondering whether you were alive." Ethan smiled gently despite the tears in his own eyes. "I wondered the same thing about you." For the first time that day, the distance between them no longer felt impossible. Lucas quietly stepped back, giving them space neither of them had been allowed to have for more than 2 decades. The audience watched in respectful silence as Ethan and Olivia shared a long conversation filled not with accusations, but with memories. They spoke about the small diner where they had first met during college, the old pickup truck Ethan had proudly restored with his father, the lakeside scholarship ceremony captured in the faded photograph, and the dreams they had once believed were waiting just ahead. Every memory reminded them that the happiest part of their lives had never truly disappeared. It had simply been interrupted. Daniel Brooks approached Lucas with another message. Every major news network is requesting interviews. They all want a statement. Lucas looked around the ballroom before answering. They will receive one, but not today. Today belongs to my family. Daniel smiled quietly and nodded. Nearby, several executives whispered among themselves. Many had arrived expecting to negotiate investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Instead, they found themselves reconsidering their own priorities. One elderly board member slowly approached Ethan and extended his hand. "This morning," he admitted honestly, "I assumed you were simply another driver waiting outside. I judged you before learning your name. I owe you an apology." Ethan accepted the handshake with a warm smile. "Thank you. That is more than enough." Soon others followed. Hotel employees, guests, business leaders, and even the young valet who had dismissed Ethan earlier came forward one after another. None of them apologized because Ethan had suddenly become connected to a billionaire. They apologized because they had finally recognized the quiet dignity that had been there from the very beginning. As the ballroom gradually emptied, Lucas asked Ethan a simple question. "Would you have dinner with us tonight?" Ethan looked uncertain. "I do not think I belong at your table." Lucas smiled. "That is exactly where you belong." Olivia nodded through tears. "Please." Ethan hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Later that evening, instead of gathering inside the Bennett mansion, Lucas made a different choice. He reserved a private room at the small neighborhood restaurant where Ethan often ate after work. The owner greeted Ethan by name, and the staff welcomed him like an old friend. Lucas quietly observed every interaction, realizing his father had built a life measured not by wealth but by kindness. During dinner they laughed for the first time together. Lucas listened to stories about Ethan's construction jobs, his years driving through Chicago winters, and the countless strangers he had helped without expecting anything in return. Ethan learned about Lucas's childhood, his education, and the lonely pressure of leading a global company while always feeling that one piece of his life was somehow missing. As dessert arrived, Lucas reached into his pocket and carefully placed the silver compass pendant beside Ethan's own on the table. The two pieces rested side by side, perfectly matching despite decades apart. Ethan looked at them in quiet amazement before lifting his eyes toward Lucas. Neither of them needed another document or another test to understand what had finally been restored. For the first time in 26 years, they were no longer searching in different directions. They had both found their way home. Over the following weeks, the story that began inside the ballroom spread across the country, but not for the reasons anyone expected. News headlines did not focus on billion-dollar investments or stock prices. Instead, they told the story of a quiet driver whose character had remained unchanged before and after the world learned who he truly was. People admired Ethan Carter not because he had become connected to one of the nation's wealthiest families, but because he had never allowed disappointment to steal his kindness. Interviews were requested every day, yet Ethan politely declined almost all of them. "Some stories belong around a family table, not in front of cameras," he would say with a gentle smile. Lucas respected that decision completely. Rather than turning their reunion into a publicity campaign, he quietly arranged something far more meaningful. 1 month after the gala, the Bennett Foundation held another gathering at the same hotel. This time there were no elaborate announcements, no giant digital screens, and no carefully rehearsed speeches. Employees from every department were invited, along with hotel staff, drivers, maintenance workers, receptionists, and community volunteers. Lucas walked onto the stage carrying only a single framed photograph. It was the faded scholarship picture that had changed everything. He looked across the audience before speaking. "For many years I believed success was measured by titles, profits, and recognition. Then I met the man who taught me that the greatest measure of a person is how they treat others when no one is watching. He invited Ethan onto the stage. The audience stood immediately, applauding with genuine respect. Ethan looked uncomfortable with so much attention, but Lucas simply smiled and waited beside him. When the applause finally settled, Lucas continued. Many people saw my father before I did. They saw a driver. They saw an employee. They saw someone easy to overlook. Very few stopped long enough to see his character. That mistake changed my life forever. Ethan quietly accepted the microphone. He looked across the crowd, recognizing the young valet, the security guard, the elderly board member, and several hotel employees who had all spoken to him that unforgettable day. I have spent most of my life believing that every person deserves respect before they earn your admiration, he said calmly, because you never know what battles someone has already survived. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. The room fell completely silent before another standing ovation filled the ballroom. Even Richard Bennett slowly rose to his feet. During the weeks following the reunion, he had resigned from every leadership position inside the family company and quietly dedicated his time to supporting the foundation without seeking recognition. He approached Ethan after the ceremony holding a small wooden box. "This belonged to my late wife," Richard said softly. "She asked me years ago to give it to you if I ever found the courage to admit the truth." Ethan carefully opened the box. Inside rested dozens of letters tied together with a blue ribbon. Every letter had been written by Olivia during the years they had been separated. None of them had ever been mailed. Ethan gently picked up the first envelope before looking toward Olivia, whose eyes filled with tears once again. "I wrote every birthday," she whispered, "every Christmas, every anniversary. I hoped that somehow, even if you never read them, the words would still exist somewhere." Ethan smiled through his own tears. "Now they do." Months later, on a peaceful Sunday afternoon beside the same lake where the old scholarship photograph had been taken decades earlier, the family gathered once again. There were no reporters, no executives, and no cameras beyond Lucas's simple phone resting on a picnic table. Ethan stood beside Olivia while Lucas adjusted the timer before hurrying back to join them. Just before the picture was taken, Lucas looked at Ethan with the same quiet warmth that had first appeared outside the hotel. "Ready, Dad?" This time Ethan did not hesitate. His smile was effortless as he answered, "Always, son." The camera captured 3 generations standing together beneath the afternoon sun, the 2 silver compass pendants reflecting the light side by side. Years later, that photograph would hang inside the Bennett headquarters beneath a simple inscription chosen by Lucas himself. It did not mention wealth, business, or success. It simply read, "Never measure a person's worth by the seat they occupy." The greatest treasures often arrive dressed as ordinary people, and the greatest legacy any family can leave behind is the courage to choose truth before pride, forgiveness before regret, and love before everything else.